All right, and welcome to another episode of the Athletic Development Show. Very special guest today, Luke McIlroy. Welcome to the show, Luke.
Thank you.
Luke is the founder and director of Mets Performance, a company that uses science to enhance performance in a safe way for endurance athletes, and kind of takes the guesswork out of that. They also do some great work in the secondary school market, which is part of what I think has created your sort of mild superpower for making complex stuff easy to understand. So that's part of why I wanted to get you on today. Is I think there's in our industry, we're strength and conditioning coaches, but so often it's like capital strength and then tiny conditioning. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about there. And he's also, in addition to that, he was part of the Science of Sport group and subsequently sold to Catapult. And he's one of those interesting souls who actively took up umpiring, which is always a fascinating one. I'm going to pick your brain about that as well.
Retired now.
So first off, what I want to get from you, Luke, is what are the things that drive you mental? What are the big obvious mistakes that a lot of people in fitness and strength and conditioning get wrong when it comes to pursuing fitness? And perhaps first in the endurance sports space and then in the team sports space as well.
Yeah, mate. I think in the endurance sports space, like our pet hate is people using generic equations to determine their training zones. Like everyone's heard the 220 minus your age, take a percentage of that to figure out your threshold or your aerobic threshold, whatever it is. And it's just never made sense. Like whether you do lab testing, whether you do field testing, you can physically measure your max heart rate, so you should measure it, right?
Yep.
We know that 220 minus your age is something that's it's a standard deviation, so it's going to be reasonably accurate for 68% of people, and then the other, is that right? And then the other 32% is going to be overs or unders, all right? So like for example, like I've got a guy that I coach regularly. He's just turned 41 and his max heart rate's 213. Right. So if he was to do 220 minus age and then do a percentage of that, he could be doing a fast walk and his heart rate would be 140. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's partly why we started doing lab-based testing, and it was just to take that guesswork out of training. So rather than taking a really low-level approach of using a generic equation, which is exactly that, it's generic based on a bunch of people.
And it's pretty arbitrary, wasn't it, how they came up with it? It was kind of just putting a bit of a line through some data there, 220 minus your age.
Essentially. And you look at it, like 220 minus your age, it's going to be, it's pretty good for under 20s, but then as you get older, it gets worse, right? So at the end of the day, I think the people that come to us, the people that come to you, the listeners today, they're generally fit athletes. So at the very basic level, go out and measure your own max heart rate and then work on percentages from that. Or as a company, what we've done is taken a step further and done lab-based testing where we're not just looking at heart rates, we're looking at blood lactate accumulation, we're looking at oxygen consumption and the correlation between the air you're breathing in, so ventilation compared to your oxygen consumption. Getting a bit sophisticated with it, but really making sure that we get accurate training zones, because once you've got your accurate training zones, you're then going to optimize your training, make every minute of training count. Because we see a lot of people that, particularly when they're using something like a 220 minus their age, that they might be accidentally or inadvertently training 40 beats too low because they actually have a really high heart rate naturally. And as a result, they're running really, really slow, getting really poor adaptation, and they're just not performing anywhere close to their potential. Because
40 beats too low, like you may as well not be bothering it in terms of the adaptations you're chasing. You're so far off it. It's not like it's a near miss, is it?
Like a lot of people that have the higher heart rate, and it's normally higher than lower.
And sorry, can we take it back a step? So I think it's really interesting to talk about how you do it, because I came along and had a play in your lab and did the running on the treadmill, the VO2 max test. That's like really scientific. There's no guesswork. That you're absolutely measuring exactly what. There's no algorithm. You're actually measuring exactly what's going on. Like that's really the gold standard, isn't it?
Yeah, essentially. So it's a direct measurement. So where you put the mask on, you're measuring your oxygen consumption. We're measuring heart rate. We're taking blood samples. You can't cheat the system, so to speak. So we are directly measuring it there. We just do an incremental ramp test. So we increase the speed of the treadmill or the increase the power on the bike every 1 to 3 minutes, depending on the protocol, and basically start you off really easy, get you to maximal effort, and then when you can't go any longer, you stop. All right, and we measure take the data points every 30 seconds. We measure a bunch of things, and we come out with your training zones.
I found it tough. I wasn't used to with the mask on. It was quite a thing, but it was great because you know exactly where you're at the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's probably the main frustration that we get from the endurance space is that, and any space, but just using generic equations when whether you come to us and do really fancy lab-based testing or whether you just do your own field-based test and do something that's specific.
What's obviously a lot of people want the gold standard, but some people, they're interstate or whatever, they're international, some of our listeners, so they can't, come along to Mulgrave and see you. What is a worthwhile way of doing it sort of, on your own?
Yeah, so I guess it comes down to what you actually want to get out of the test. Now, most people, your VO2 max number is a number, right? It's going to get you in the ballpark to be successful at anything that involves aerobic endurance. But at the end of the day, it's the training prescription off the back of those numbers, which is really important. So what you can do to get your maximal aerobic speed, I'm sure a lot of your listeners use that as opposed to what we say velocity at VO2 max, but to get your maximal aerobic speed, there's quite a lot of research out there.
Take us back and talk because there'll be some that don't.
Sure.
And MAS is a little confusing because there's actually Maffetone as well who talks about...
and eye roll for those that are listening.
And he's all about training is like really not hard at all. Like you got to train for months, incredibly low levels, and then train hard. So people can sometimes confuse the two.
Yeah.
Can you please talk us through what MAS is and what it's for?
Yeah, and Maffetone is probably the next on the list of things that I don't.
Yeah, I can tell. I want to get into that.
I'll come to that. So maximal aerobic speed, it's basically the minimum intensity to elicit VO2 max. So it's the minimum running speed to get to your actual VO2 max. So it's going pretty hard, all right? And
because when you describe it, that sounds easy. Because minimum intensity, it's like, but no, it's not.
The minimum intensity to elicit your actual maximal oxygen consumption. So it's pretty hard. And the gold standard is lab-based testing. But if you do a 4.5 minute time trial, as hard as you can go, that's very closely correlated to your maximal aerobic speed. So if you're a runner, go to an athletics track, run as hard as you can consistently maintain. You don't want to start strong and fade, but you be as consistently hard.
So you get up to a pace you can hold.
Yeah, but it needs to be a 10 out of 10 rating of perceived exertion. So you're going as hard as you can. You take that average from the 4.5 minutes.
So 10 out of 10. Should you be nearly spewing at the end of it?
Yeah. Yeah, you'd be pretty tired. Yeah. you should hit a true max heart rate, but importantly, it's that average speed, and then from that you can then prescribe training based on a percentage of your maximal aerobic speed, as opposed to something like the Maffetone method or what he.
Tell us all about his thing. His has gotten is very slickly marketed, and he tells good stories.
Yes.
But I remember listening to him, and I was thinking, Luke would grind his gears.
It's one of the. It's just
because he's a chiropractor by training as well. He's not an exercise physiologist, is he?
Yeah, I don't know.
You don't even like thinking about it.
I know. I look at the philosophies, and essentially. The Maffetone method is all about finding that aerobic threshold. So that's your long, easy training. That's you're not even close to threshold. Which
is very pleasant.
Aerobics. It's very easy. It should be a 3 or a 4 out of 10 perceived exertion. But essentially it's 180, take away your age, and then plus or minus a few beats based on a questionnaire. Things like how long you've been training for, so on and so forth.
Have you been sick in the last 2 years?
Exactly right. Yeah. So it's again comes down to that generic equation. It's similar to 220 minus your age. It's this arbitrary number of 180, take away your age, and then
ballpark it.
At least it goes up and down based on some things. But again, where does 180 come from? So it's a little bit generic, a little bit too generic for my liking. And the other thing is that it's only one training zone. Like it's all like that's just your long, slow, easy aerobic runs. But that's one zone out of, again, whether you use a 3-zone system, a 5-zone, I've seen up to 11 zones before, but that's one zone for one specific adaptation. But there's a lot of different components of aerobic power, of fitness. So
you're missing out on a lot.
It's just like going to the gym and just doing local muscular endurance training. You're just going to do 15 reps.
Curls and leg extensions.
Yeah, and that's it. And there you're going to be a well-rounded athlete. So it's a similar sort of philosophy.
Okay. Tell us about, I think, you're talking about the zones there. I'm interested in unpacking the different types of endurance training in terms of building capacity and aerobic power and so forth. Because I still think a lot of people are more fuzzy than they would like to admit around this stuff, because it is a little complex at first. If you could walk us through that, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. So look, at the end of the day, there's many different zone systems you can use, and the most important thing is that you just understand what they mean and what the goal of each zone is. So we use a 5-zone system. The first zone is active recovery, so you're not trying to get any aerobic stimulus, you're just trying to recover from a race the day before, a training session the day before, a footy game, whatever it is. This is the only one that is an arbitrary number, and we use less than 56% VO2 max because that's what the American College of Sports Medicine said, and that's what the AIS use, and it's just a really easy intensity. It's just a slow slow jog, slow swim, slow cycle. From there, we then go up to our ventilatory threshold.
Sorry, and in that one, and so really what you're getting is you're utilizing the skeletal muscle pump. You're just generally just creating active recovery to pump old blood out, fresh blood in, get the tissues moving a bit. That's basically what you're achieving.
Yeah, exactly right. You're not getting any mitochondrial adaptations. You're not improving your ability to take up, transport, utilize oxygen. You are just purely recovering through the skeletal muscle pump and providing oxygen to the tissues and things like that.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, cool. Sorry, carry on.
So zone 2 would be our aerobic endurance zone. So that's when you're trying to build your aerobic capacity. So when I say aerobic capacity, I like to explain it as the ability to get to the finish line using the aerobic system. Okay, you're not getting to the finish line quickly, you're just getting to the finish line. If you want to run a marathon, you have to have an adequate aerobic capacity to run a marathon. So for that zone, we go up to, this is what we measure in the lab. It's called ventilatory threshold number 1 or lactate threshold number 1. It's basically when, you know, when you're running really easily and then you're increasing the intensity, you feel like you need to just take a slightly deeper breath. It's almost that intensity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can still chat.
You can still chat. Yep. So the top of that zone is what we're not in the elevated presence of lactic acid. So you shouldn't feel that burn in the arms or the legs. It's an uncomfortable intensity. We can actually look at the graphs and say, all right, that's where it is.
Yep.
But what you would feel is it's almost like that urge to take a slightly deeper breath.
Yeah. Okay.
If that makes sense.
And within that zone, you're getting mitochondrial biogenesis in that. That's where you're building more mitochondria. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. There's 2 ways to do it, but that's one of them. Yep.
And what other benefits are you getting? Is that the big rock? Because that's kind of the one that gets the sort of airtime because it sounds cool.
Yeah.
Are there other major benefits that you're getting in that zone?
Yeah, there is. So mitochondrial adaptations, that's at the muscular level, but at the end of the day, if we want to improve our oxygen uptake, our VO2 max, we have to look at the lungs, the heart, and the muscles. So at the muscles, we have the mitochondrial biogenesis, so increased number, size, and surface area. We get bigger mitochondria, therefore they can use more oxygen.
Yep.
Also, we need to feed those mitochondria, so that's a slight increase in myoglobin. Viewers have probably heard of hemoglobin, which is carrying oxygen in the blood. Myoglobin is carrying oxygen in the muscle. Slight increase, not much, but then the capillarization at the muscle as well. So the capillaries is what feeds the muscle. We go through the heart, from the heart to the arteries, to the small arteries, to the capillaries, which is where the diffusion occurs. So oxygen comes in and carbon dioxide comes out. So we get more capillaries surrounding the muscle, which gives us more opportunity to get the oxygen in the muscle. And then the myoglobin will carry the oxygen to the mitochondria, which is where obviously the aerobic energy is produced. So that's all at the muscular level. But then we've also got at the lungs, we can get increased we call it alveoli surface area, alveoli capillary surface areas. The alveoli are in their little air sacs in the lungs, and we've got capillaries, which is where the diffusion occurs. So again, we get more capillaries around the alveoli.
So your ratio of capillaries to surface area is increasing.
Yep. So therefore, we can
servicing that better.
Yeah. Diffuse more oxygen from the lungs to the bloodstream. We can then transport more oxygen in the bloodstream because we can get more hemoglobin, and an increase in our left ventricle size, so our heart gets bigger. If it gets bigger, it can beat out more blood in a single beat. So with all them put together, it's the lungs, the heart, and the muscles all working together.
It's so fascinating. All of that is happening from that relatively low intensity work. Like that work's not that taxing, and you're stimulating those adaptations.
Yep. Yeah. So there's good evidence to show that up to about a VO2 max of about 60 mils per kilo, which is pretty fit, but not elite, but it's pretty fit. You could just do that long, slow, easy training. But then if you want to take it up a notch, you really need to include what we'll get to is zone 4 training, which is getting right up to that VO2 max pace. That's where the MAS comes into it.
Okay, so we're up to zone, I keep interrupting, sorry.
Yeah, so
we're up to zone 3 now.
Yeah, so zone 3 is when we start to get we call it the anaerobic threshold or the lactate threshold, lactate inflection point. They all sort of mean the same thing or very closely correlated. So this is on a graph. It's when our lactate goes from being from slightly rising to absolutely very sharply rising.
Turns the corner.
Yeah, it turns the corner. So we can hold our threshold, which is our zone 3, in theory for about 45 to 60 minutes. Elite athletes a little bit longer. But if you go beyond your threshold, we're going to accumulate the lactic acid, which is the burn that you feel in the legs. And it's a matter of time before you have to slow down due to fatigue. So we find in a ramp test where we're gradually increasing the intensity every 3 minutes. I've never seen anybody, whether they're amateur or elite, never seen anybody last more than 7 minutes beyond their threshold because the increased lactic acidity is it's inhibiting, I'm not going to get sophisticated, glycolytic enzymes. It's inhibiting the muscles to contract, essentially.
They just can't do it.
They can't do it, So So the top of zone 3 is that point where you can just hold it. You're right on the limit. This is your 20-minute time trial, your 5K.
And so that's hurting and it's burning?
Yes. Yeah. But it's sustainable. It's at that maximal sustainable pace for 45 to 60 minutes theoretically. Yeah. The fourth zone, which is another one that we use a lot, that's probably the one that I think most people need to use more often is our zone 4. So that's basically from that point where you're right on the limit, right up into 100% VO2 max. So your maximal aerobic speed, your velocity at VO2 max. Now, the goal of this zone is that you want to accumulate time at VO2 max. And you want to accumulate about, depends on team sport versus endurance sport. Team sport, you're looking at sort of 6 to 7 minutes. An endurance athlete, individual sport, you're looking at closer to 9 or 10 minutes of time spent at VO2 max.
Like right on that limit. Yeah,
right on it. So that's a really good stimulus to do very similar things to that zone 2 stuff, increase mitochondrial biogenesis, increase left ventricle size of the heart. Very similar benefits, but it's attacking it via a different pathway. So there's 2 ways to get, I remember reading the research, there's 2 ways to get that mitochondrial stimulus. One's through a calcium pathway, which is just your long, slow, easy Ks, and one's through what we call the AMPK kinase pathway. Essentially, it means we're breaking down energy very quickly, and that's also going to create the same it's called PGC1A, doesn't matter, the same protein which says, hey, let's get more mitochondria, let's get better aerobic energy.
And hence the term power, because it's actually about the ability to deliver that in the shortest space of time.
Yeah, it's got to be quickly. And that's VO2 max, what it is. It's the maximum volume of oxygen you can take in transport and utilize in a minute. So it's got that power component. Right? So you can get up to that 60 odd mils per kilo doing the easy stuff, but if you want to push that power, the rate of energy production, you've got to do the higher intensity stuff. And that's where, when we come to prescribing training specifically for endurance athletes, but it's really the same for team sport athletes as well, you would have heard of the polarized training model.
I wanted to ask you about that,
You're either going easy or you're going hard. So we either go zone 2 or you're going zone 4, and you're cutting out a lot of that zone 3 stuff. The zone 3 stuff, that's not to say it's bad, but if you're looking for an aerobic stimulus, go easy or go hard. Get time at VO2 max or keep it really sub-max where you're not accumulating elevated lactic acid levels, and you'll get a better stimulus. On that, I might just mention, so in terms of accumulating time at VO2 max, you can't just go out and run 10 minutes as hard as you can and expect to get 10 minutes of time at VO2 max. We spoke before that if you do a 4.5 minute time trial, maximal vomiting at the end almost, that's your maximal aerobic speed. Well, you can't do that for 10 minutes in a row. So that's when you talk about work to rest ratios. And there's a lot of different work to rest ratios that you would consider depending on the specificity of the sport. Like a team sport athlete, when they're going to do a bit more repeat sprint stuff, you might do something like 15 seconds, really hard, 45 seconds recovery. A triathlete or a runner, that's not very specific for them. So they might do something like 3 minutes on, 1.5 minutes active recovery, something like that.
So they're quite different ratios.
They are very different ratios, but the end goal is to accumulate that depending on the event, whether it's team sports sort of 6 or 7 minutes or endurance athletes up to 10 of time at VO2 max.
And so if you're just racking up a whole bunch of 15-second exposures at VO2 max, they don't have to, they can be all well separated. It's just what matters is the cumulative racking up of those from a team sport athlete, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. So if you would think about, if you just went as hard as you can, or go out for a run for as hard as you can, you're going to be exhausted after 4.5 minutes, session done, right? But if you can break them into more sizable chunks, you can accumulate that 10 minutes over a longer session. So it might take you 30 minutes of training time. You might be running for 15 minutes and resting for 15 minutes, which is a 30-minute total session. And of that, you've spent 10 minutes of time at VO2 max. That's the stimulus. That's what matters.
So it's essentially just finding the right work to rest ratio for you to, whether it's 15 on, 45 off, 30, a minute on, 30 off, 2 on, 1 off, 3 on, 3, whatever. So, it's finding the intensity and of the work period and the intensity of the rest period, which accumulates the desired amount of time spent at VO2 max.
All right. Now I'm going to ask a self-interested question here, because we talked about this a while ago, and I put that into place with my training. But what I found was that I really discovered my inner wuss when it came to the top end stuff, because I can run all day, but I would just find that, there's a little voice on the side of your shoulder say, oh, you quit now, it's really hard, you're hurting, you should back off a little, you're old. I would find that trying to run for, say, 3 minutes really hard, I would just end up really running for a minute 45 well, and then having a real drop off. What do you reckon? And I reckon a lot of people are in that same boat, because it really hurts. Like it's not you don't feel good about yourself as you're doing it. It's not fun. What do you reckon is this, in the same way, like for on the bike, often 8 and 12s is really good because everyone can go hard for 8 seconds on, 12 seconds off.
Yep.
So in terms of a compliance standpoint, even a relative wuss can still push it out pretty hard, 8 on, 12 off. Is there a sweet spot you think that can mean that it's kind of most people can get good value time-wise? Like is there a certain length of time or ratio that you think for a team sport athlete that wants to get fitter, say?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the team sport athlete, like there's a few factors to consider. Like, are you doing it yourself or as part of a team? If you've got 20 athletes doing the same session,
much easier to work hard.
Yeah, but if you've got 20 athletes, it's much easier to keep it a shorter duration as well. If you've got people doing 4-minute efforts, it's a bit hard to keep on top of. In terms of an optimal, like it's going to come down to the individual. But as you said, the shorter, the easier. No, it's not really easier because as you go shorter, you're going to have a higher intensity to get the desired amount. So if you're doing things like 15-second efforts, you're going to want to be at about 120% MAS. Versus if you're doing a 2 or 3 minute effort, you're at 95, 97.5%. So as the duration of the work effort decreases, the intensity increases or the rest period decreases, depending on what you're doing. So you're always going to be on that limit. You're at VO2 max. So you're right out there the whole time. So it's just whatever combination works best for you. Now, I come back to your question. I always start with, again, we work a lot with endurance athletes. I find 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off manageable. I understand 3 is hard. 2 I find manageable.
You can grit your teeth and hang on for dear life, kind of.
But a good alternative would be like a 40-20, something like that. 40 on, 20 off.
Okay.
And the 40 on would be about 120%, and the 20 off would just be passive.
And from a team sports point of view, you're also from a sort of fast twitch fiber sense, you're actually working closer to how you're going to be working in your sport as well because you're running faster.
Yeah, exactly. So team sport athletes would rarely do more than a minute of effort time because it's not specific. I can't think of a team sport where you're doing a steady state effort for a minute. So, 15 seconds of work or 30 or 45, they're kind of the go-tos.
Yeah.
And if you want the more aerobic stimulus, you're looking at a higher work time than rest time. So 40, like a 2 to 1. So like 40 seconds on, 20 seconds off. Yeah. Or it wouldn't be for an aerobic stimulus, but the other way, if you want to stimulate more fast twitch fibers, anaerobic capacity, etc., it might go the other way. It might be like a 1 to 2 or a 1 to 3. It could be 20 seconds on, 60 seconds off, or 10 seconds on, 30 seconds off. But you'd be going harder, but having more recovery.
More rest.
But you would get less aerobic stimulus, but you get more anaerobic capacity stimulus. So it depends what you're trying to do.
Okay. And I've heard people have talked in the past about the idea that you can chase your anaerobic stimulus and you will still be actually achieving aerobic stimulus in the rest periods. Is that true?
It is, depending on how hard you're going. So if you go really hard, let me preface it by saying, if you're unfit, you do anything, you get fitter, as you know. Yeah. When we start to get to a more well-trained athlete, then that is true. There is some research out there to say that 7 efforts of 30 seconds maximal and a 4-minute passive recovery is a pretty good aerobic stimulus, because if you're going absolutely maximal for 30 seconds.
So 30 seconds and 4 minutes between efforts.
Yeah, but you have to go flat out, 100%.
Yeah, right.
And if anyone who's done that, I'm vomiting after 4 minutes. Like, I'm done after 1, let alone 7.
Yeah.
But because of the huge, I don't know what word you use, epoch, oxygen debt, because of the oxygen required during the recovery period is so high, that is giving yourself an aerobic stimulus. So as long as you go really, really hard in that shorter duration, then you can actually have a lot of rest and still get an aerobic stimulus.
So you'd be disinclined in a team sport setting to do that with large teams, because people, like, there's some injury potential in terms of people running really ragged. But you could do that, I suppose, quite well on a bike workout if you've got a bunch of bikes and people are absolutely smashing it for 30 seconds on the bike.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so that's an option. So you could cross-train and do a low-load alternative, such as cycling, such as swimming if you've got a good swimmer, or a rower. Or the alternative is you could decrease the intensity. Well, we're not talking about going flat out here. We're talking going back to like a 30 on, 30 off sort of protocol. But you could reduce the working intensity if you either decrease the rest time or you increased the rest intensity. So you could do like, let's say you've got you're a high performance manager, you're running a conditioning program for an AFL club, and they say, hey, we don't want any high speed. We're limiting high speed running tonight because they've had a hard game. Right? Like, oh, well, I had 95% VO2 max stuff, teed up for the session. That's too fast. You can't go above 88%. or whatever.
Yep.
All right, what do you do? Well, you could either increase the duration, but then that's probably going to increase the load with it. But what you probably would do instead is, all right, let's reduce that intensity from 95 to 88, which is what the boss said to do.
Yep.
Yeah. But as a alternative, we're going to reduce the rest period, or we're going to increase the intensity of the rest period.
So you have like a floating run rather than a complete rest.
Exactly right. Yeah. So you'll still get the time at VO2 max and the aerobic stimulus, but you'll have lower load on the body.
That's smart.
Yeah.
I like it. Sorry, I think that was one big interruption for me. So what
we're up to?
we did 4, so that was 4, wasn't it? That's where you're going flat, for instance, absolute flat chat for 2 minutes, 2 minutes off, and you're getting that ability.
Time at VO2 max.
VO2 max. You're racking up, and I think of it like a computer game. You know when you rack up all those little credit points. It's like it's almost like that. Like you just got to rack up those points at VO2 max.
Yeah,
okay, so that's 4.
Zone 5 for us, because we work predominantly with endurance athletes, it's very rare that we need to worry about neuromuscular adaptations and things like that. So for us, zone 5 is above 100% velocity at VO2 max. So it's going anywhere from 101% to maximal effort. Now, I think for team sport athletes, it would be sensible to use a more sophisticated zoning system. Yourself, you know that intent to lift is really important if you're looking at power or strength adaptation. So we simplify it and say above 100%, but then if you're going above 100%, it's almost go really like maximal effort off fresh legs. But so we use a 5-zone system, but then if we recommend that our athletes need to get into the gym or do anything to improve their strength or their power, obviously it's neuromuscularly and metabolically fresh, as hard as you can go, maximal intent to lift, etc.
Okay, cool. Now, circling back to polarized training, Jacob and I we both read about it, talked about it, and thought about it, and it makes all the sense in the world that you avoid that kind of death valley where you're in the middle, where you're working hard enough to make yourself tired but not hard enough to really stimulate the adaptations you want. And so we both polarized our training, but we only run 3 times a week. And what we both noticed was actually we went backwards a little bit in our own training because we weren't what we suspect it actually works best when you've got a higher volume of total sessions. Is that an accurate guess as to, like, it felt like when we were then trying to run hard, we just didn't have that sort of endurance at running at a good pace. So we could run short and sharp fast and we could run slow. We actually missed that sort of almost race pace running. Is that a function of only having 3? Like, are you recommending that for people that are doing 5 sessions or more? Where's the threshold where you reckon it actually works best? Yeah,
I mean, it's going to probably depend on how much time you have to train. So let's say you've got a 45-minute window 3 times a week to train. 45 minutes of doing a zone 2 very easy run versus 45 minutes of high intensity interval training. I'm picking high intensity interval training every day of the week in terms of a bigger aerobic stimulus for a small amount of time. If the alternative is that you can get out and do a 2-hour zone 2 run or a 45-minute hit session, maybe that's where the discussion is depending on the specificity of your sport and where you're at in your training program, then you might want to prioritize a longer run. In terms of comparing bang for buck, minute for minute, zone 2 versus zone 4, so hit versus easy, hit's going to be better. It's going to be more effective. But then when you talk about specificity of your event, if you want to go and run a marathon, not a marathon, let's do a 10K run, which maybe takes you 40 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever it is. If you don't do zone 3 stuff, you haven't done any specific training, because you're not going to be going up and overs for your VO2 max stuff, and you're not going to be going a cruisy, 5:30, 6-minute K pace as you would for your zone 2s. You need to do more race specific stuff, which is where that zone 3 stuff comes in. So from a physiological perspective, you are best to do zone 2, zone 4, but then from almost like a competency perspective, like almost your own mental, resilience, you have to be able to work.
You've got to be used to it, haven't you?
Exactly right. You got to work hard. The 80-20 rule is probably worth touching base on. So 80-20 is a pretty popular concept where 80% of your training is easy and 20% is really hard. And that works. The reason that's come about is because if you're let's say you're a professional endurance athlete, you're probably racking up 20 to 25 hours a week of training. Now, you can't do 10 hours of high intensity interval training.
You'd die.
Oh, yeah, you can't do a 50-50 split. So the 80-20 came from that. Like, it would be irresponsible to do a huge amount of high intensity work. You probably only need to do it, we recommend 2 to 3 times a week. And that will be based on somebody training pretty much every day, if not 6 days a week. So to answer your question, if you were doing 3 times a week, what's your sport? I guess that's the background. Are you team sport?
Sure. Let's make
team sport. I'd be doing all hit.
Yeah.
All of it.
because it's just the other ones.
And that's probably coming back to question number one. I mentioned the misconceptions or what frustrates me with endurance sport. Well, with a team sport, it's very rare that you would need to do any long, slow volume. If you're short for time, high intensity interval training will give you a better stimulus. It's more applicable to your sport. It's more specific. It's just better bang for buck. Gone are the days where you need to go out for an hour and a half run in pre-season.
I'm so glad to have you. I've got this on record. It's great. I've always had that belief. So every WNBL team I've ever worked with, no one's ever run for more than 40 meters in a row because it's 16 meters foul line to foul line. If we do our job well and no one gets injured, they play all the time. They get plenty fit. You don't need the long, slow, 5K base building run. You just do high intensity work.
Yeah. So there's scope to include some of that if you have a conditioning focus, such as off season or pre-season, when you've got less technical, tactical work, less gym work, so on and so forth. Then there's scope to do it. But if you're limited to a certain amount of conditioning time, particularly in season, then you're going to go straight to HIIT because it's the best bang for buck.
Particularly when you've got a season like for a junior in Victoria, it's a 48-week season basically. Yeah. Okay, great. So those are all of the levels. That's great to get a handle on that. I wanted to ask you, what do you think the difference is in terms of, we talk in endurance and then we talk team sports, which are two very broad categories. Do you think there is then a difference between court sports and your field sports? Obviously you're going to want your field sports people to be exposed to longer distances because that's the nature of the ground. Is it basically about the same in terms of the ratios? It's just you stretch out the distances more?
I would say, yes, you could use any ratio, but I think from a specificity perspective, you'd probably do slightly longer HIIT for a field-based sport because they're going to be running longer distances.
Yep.
And then you do more change of direction HIIT for a court sport athlete. And anybody who's not following Nathan Heaney, the conditioning consultant.
Yeah, he's great.
Mate, I actually learned a lot of this because I'm an endurance background. I learned a lot of this team sport stuff from him. So give him a follow.
Give him a follow on Insta. He's really good.
Yeah, the conditioning consultant.
Yeah.
But he spoke about in a webinar recently about the oxygen cost of a change of direction, and it was like 0.3 seconds or something like that. So you have to account for let's say your maximal aerobic speed is 15 k's an hour, or then if you're doing up and back efforts on a court, so you might be doing a 30-second effort, but you've got to change direction four times.
Change direction is tiring.
Yeah, so you've got to take off 0.3 seconds for that. So from a specificity perspective, and then I guess from a training prescription perspective, you do need to take into account things like change of direction because they're hard work. So in terms of the goals of time at VO2 max, very, very much the same. It's just how you achieve that. From a specificity perspective, you might do a bit shorter for court athletes and take into account change of direction. Might be less change of direction, slightly longer intervals for a field-based athlete, depending on the demands of the activity.
Yeah, nice. Now, there's so many different fields to go into in the sports science field. I'm really curious. Yours is an area that isn't as magnetic. Not as many people go into it as they do. Like the strength side is often a little sexier. People go after that. There's a bigger crowd there. What drew you to? Because I find this fascinating, so it's great to talk about it. And I think it's such an underdone area. What drew you to it?
Yeah, personal enjoyment really. Like I guess my background has been, as you said, umpiring football originally. I've done plenty of cycling, crit racing on the bike, triathlon, things like that. So my personal interest has always been in endurance sport myself. Went to uni, did my 3-year undergrad degree in exercise.
Were you good at it? Because you're quite muscular. You look almost like you're not quite built as an endurance sport person.
No, I'm definitely better at the anaerobic stuff. I just don't enjoy training for it.
Yeah, okay, right.
I used to be a bit slimmer, but I've let myself go a little bit. So did my 3-year undergrad, really enjoyed like the exercise physiology subjects.
Yeah.
And I remember I was in a lab, I put my hand up to do the VO2 max test and they said, you got 5 litres of VO2 max is 5 litres. And I was like, what does that mean? Whatever. Right. And I couldn't get any more information out of them. So I did my own research and I was really interested in it. And essentially when I left uni, I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to do fitness testing. I want to work in the conditioning space and there's no jobs. There's nothing there.
There's a vacuum there, isn't there?
Yeah. I actually applied for an internship at the Victorian Institute of Sport.
Yep.
Obviously volunteering my time, couldn't get that or didn't get that. I didn't even get an interview.
Wow.
So I just sort of researched what the cost of it would be to go out myself and I bought the machine and
you made your own institute.
Just had it. I thought, I look back and it was to be honest, pretty ballsy decision. I decided in November of 2015 that this was a good idea and I launched in 4th of February 2016. So it was a 3-month turnaround, and
you've built
myself.
I remember when we got to know each other, and you first sort of walked me through how your business works. I was blown away because it's a really good business model. It's a thing people really need. We're talking business about product market fit. Like the people that want it really want it, which is great. When it was designing that, did you just design the thing that you would have wanted as an athlete? Was it that simple a process, or were you more strategic in time working out what the market wanted?
I definitely wasn't more strategic than that at the start. I'd say I'm a bit more competent in the business side now. But when I started, it was just, I'd do this. I think this is a good idea. I'd buy it. I'd do it. Yeah. It would help me. So I started that way, and then just steered the ship from there. Definitely on the school side. So we do head out to schools and do similar sort of things, but link it to the education space.
Yep.
That was more of people came to me and said, hey, you should do this, and then we explored it that way. But when we first initially started, the first 18 months or so, it was very much, I'd buy it. I think this is good. So let's get it started. And as you know, in business, it's never goes to plan the first little while. It's not an instant success.
Trial and error,
as you'd like to think it is. But in the athlete space, we have kept pretty over. We've been going for about 5.5 years now. It's been kept pretty consistent in terms of where we started and where we are now. The philosophies, the business model on that side hasn't changed a whole lot. So something's working.
Yeah, it's great. And so for the average athlete that comes along and sees you, so there's a membership option, or they can purchase one-off testing. What's the standard sort of what's the process? So someone comes in, you run, what's a typical assessment you'd run for a distance runner or triathlete?
So we always start off with a VO2 max test with lactate analysis. So it's essentially a ramp test. So starting off easy, progressively getting harder every 3 minutes, taking blood lactate samples, taking their oxygen consumption, taking their heart rate. From that, we're going to find their training zones and also their physiological strengths and weaknesses. So I can basically have a look at the data and say, you need to do more zone 2 training, or you need to do more zone 4 training. And that's where you're going to get the biggest benefit from your training. You might be really good at, say, 2 areas, but then you might have a 20% scope to improve in one area. So why wouldn't you just go for the low-hanging fruit?
Because you could put all your effort and only improve 2% in your strength, but you could improve 18% in your weakness. Yeah?
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. So we sit down and go through that, and then give them some, all right, well, we've identified that you need to improve your aerobic power. So here's a list of a couple of exercises you should do, and off you go and get started. So that's sort of that entry level service. And then, as you alluded to there, we ended up creating a membership option where we just wanted to remove the financial barrier of having to pay sessionally, because we have a lot more offerings than just that test. So now it's just like, hey, you get that test, but you also get sweat testing because you might be cramping during an endurance race. You get skin fold testing, so on and so forth, consulting, etc.
Yeah. What does the sweat testing tell you? So because people's sweat rate varies. Like I've known that from training. Some people like sweat pores off them. Some people don't sweat much at all. What do you get? How analytical is the sweat testing? What does it tell you?
It's certainly not a perfect system because, as you said, sweat rate's going to change depending on the day or what the temperature is. But what we try to achieve from the sweat test is measuring the sodium concentration. So if you can link the sodium concentration in your sweat with your sweat rate, theoretically you should be able to have a very good idea of how much sodium and how much fluid you need to replenish. So people will come to us and we'll get them to essentially run or ride on a ride for 30 minutes to 60 minutes, get them sweating lots. We don't take too much notice of the sweat rate because, as you know, it's going to change. We measure the sodium concentration, and then what we say is, all right, this sodium concentration shouldn't change significantly unless you change climates. So you go from here to go live in Malaysia or go to Cairns or something like that for a long time. Sometimes winter to summer, but not as much. So if this sodium concentration doesn't change, then all you need to do is find a day which is closely mimicking the race day environment. So maybe you find a hot day, you're going over to Western Australia where it's not humid, but it's going to be 35 degrees. So it happens to be, hey, one day was a 35 degree day in Melbourne. Go do your sweat rate test, just an hour. 1 kilo lost is 1 litre of fluid plus a few percentage because you're going to keep sweating afterwards. But then plug that number into your sodium concentration and you get a pretty close hydration plan. Again, not a perfect system, but better than nothing.
And it varies enough from person to person for that to be worthwhile to optimise?
The sodium loss does, and also the sweat rate, to be honest. And you know, there's those adaptations as well. Like it's a different story if you go up to Cairns before a Cairns Ironman where it's quite humid up there, it takes about 14 days to get the adaptation of an increased sweat rate and a reduced sodium loss. So the numbers can change once you start to acclimatise. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you're cramping, it's either, I always say as a good starting point, if you're cramping in a race, see how much weight you've lost. If you've lost more than 2% body weight equivalent, then you're significantly dehydrated. And then also if you see, you see the salt stains on people's racing suits and things like that, that's an indicator that maybe you're losing a lot of salt. So if cramping is not a problem, I probably wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, right.
If cramping is a problem, then let's do some research into
dial
it.
Dial into it. Yeah,
fascinating.
100%. So I wanted to ask you before we go, because I know you've pressed for time.
That's right.
So you mentioned Nathan Heaney.
Yes.
Where else do you go for your? And he's a great resource. Like, highly recommend. Really knows his stuff and has crossed the sports, the team sports side with a really strong physiology basis as well. Who else do you look to for good information in this space that people might look at?
To be honest, mate,
it's not research, much, is there?
Yeah, the research, that's it. And even then, I probably read less research now than I did back in the heyday. But yeah, really. So
basically, your website, because you've got a bunch of great YouTube content there.
Such a limited. Conditioning is such a whether it's just not advertised well. I don't know. There's just not many people that I think are great at the conditioning. And Nathan's one who's awesome. Matty Graham from New Zealand, he's got a fairly good YouTube channel. He's got similar philosophies to ourselves in terms of periodizing like a training program. But there's not a lot. A lot of it's just, to be honest, is just scouring through different sort of research articles and picking up almost individual training sessions. And like, for example, the good one is the 7 repeats of 30 seconds maximal 4-minute recovery. Like it just happened to be in a research article.
That's very actionable, isn't it?
Yeah. So things like that. So to be honest, mate, I mean, you've got the ACSM and you've got AIS guidelines and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's self-research really.
Yeah. Cool. And so if I were to summarize the big ticket takeaway for most people out of all of your knowledge, it would probably be hit that aerobic power properly. Like, really make sure you've ticked that box, because that's the most unticked box that you would suggest on average.
100%. Yeah, I think if you're an endurance athlete, you know that you need to go and run distances. So people already do that well. So that's a strength.
It's been ticked.
But what they're not doing is that really high intensity work, because they think, oh, well, that's not specific. Well, it's not, but it does have a very good physiological stimulus, which is going to help you improve your performance. And then maybe even the team sport as well, the old style of let's go out and run, long, easy. Maybe there's a place for that pre-season if you've got plenty of time to spend on conditioning. But again, bang for buck, use your high intensity interval training. You really need to accumulate that sort of, depending on what you're doing, sort of 6 to 10 minutes of time at VO2 max. You can't do that in a single effort because you'll physically die. So you need to figure out an appropriate work to rest ratio for you to achieve that result.
Get that done. Awesome. Thanks so much for being on the show. We're going to put links to Luke's business on the show notes, and also we'll put the links to Nathan Heaney stuff as well, because that's interesting to have a look at. And thanks heaps. And,
thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Good stuff. Okay, hope you enjoyed that episode. You'll find all the relevant show notes over at coreadvantage.com.au. Also on the website, you can find more information about our athletic development services, education, short courses, and everything else we're up to. So that's coreadvantage.com.au. Cheers, guys. See ya.